Well, good afternoon again, neighbors and friends, and welcome back to El Monticello. Back for another conversation and discussion about remarkable things that continue to remind us that we are surely a family of man and cannot help but to progress together to improve the condition of mankind. And that is why I welcome the subject of today's discussion. It is in the realms of science, in particular, the subject of antiquities. Oh, I consider myself an antiquarian. I have been a member of several antiquarian societies for the majority of my life. And here in our Indian Hall, we're better to point out relics of antiquities that help us better understand where we have been, to help us all better understand that civilization is an ongoing process. We are not the first. There are many who have come before us. And so we, in our time, continue to establish a particular civilization which we hope rests upon that term, the civilizing of man. I welcome once more Mr. Brandon Dillon to ask questions of us here today and to be our moderator. And if you would allow, I'd be happy to take a chair during our discussion. Well, thank you. Thank you very, very much. Well, now, Mr. Dillard, I'm certainly ready for the first question amongst our friends. So please, if you will, upon the subject of antiquities.
So when did you first become interested in archaeology?
Interested in archaeology. I have heard that term. It has been very much of late. A term, in my opinion, quite relevant to antiquities. It comes from two Greek words, archos, a prototype, if you will, something ancient that has established a standard, and ology, the study of, the love of. So if you ask me when did I become interested in such a study of ancient antiquities, I would say from the time of my youth. I was born and grew up out here in the wilderness, the wilds of Albemarle County. And I knew as a child that we were not the first to inhabit this beautiful environment of nature. No, not my father, not any Englishman who went before us, not any European who went before us. Because you see, I grew up amongst the Monacan people of the Cherokee Nation, the natives of this land. We were friends with them, attended to their camps. They came to visit us at Chadwell Farm. Later here, many who came to visit at Monticello. So I would say that from my youth, the questions of where did their ancestors come from? Had they already been here? There were many, many theories about this, and even the Monacans could not answer distinctly how long their people had been here. Here, there was a conversation that perhaps there were people here even before their ancestors arrived. So that is when I surely became interested in the subject of antiquities. And this most unique and different for us as Americans, because this was not the ancient history of the former civilizations of Rome or the city-states of Greece or the many kingdoms of Europe. This was specifically North America. And so I would say from my youth, the study of ancient history and the natives of this land has remained for me most fascinating. Your next question.
Do you think archaeology is a valid field of enlightened science?
Oh, there you go again, archaeology. I am thankful you bring up that term. Do you know, I have never written the word archaeology, not in all the many thousands of letters that I have put forth. I doubt that I have even received the word in a letter sent to me. So if you're asking, do I believe in such a method of science that is using the study of past civilizations as distinct, let's say, from the study of nature and the fossils that we discover of former creatures that inhabit this globe, perhaps even long before man appeared? Well, I would say yes, the study of archaeology is most worthy. And I hope perhaps that I have added something to it in my early investigations as to who were the natives of this land before the Europeans arrived. The next question.
Can you tell us more about this first attempt at practicing archaeology yourself?
My first attempt. I hope it is not offensive. I dug into what were known as Indian burrows or Indian mounds. Now, you may ask, well, what was the reason for it? Well, the reason was simply to understand what they represented. Are they indeed monuments of a past civilization? The Monicans, whom I referred to earlier, would often venture en masse to visit many of these Indian mounds in the locality here of Charlottesville. In fact, just north, above where the Rivanna forks, I would venture to say opposite many hills and on the opposite side of the Rivanna where we knew there had been a Monacan camp, the Monacans would come to visit these mounds. And when we would inquire of them whether they were their ancestors, there were not so precise answers as there was the recognition that they were monuments of a people well before. And so the curiosity began. Who were those people before? Were they Native Americans? There were many already, and Dr. Franklin was one of them, who assumed that these mounds might have been built by European peoples. Perhaps the Spanish, centuries before. After all, they had come to North America from the kingdoms of Europe first, so we believe. But then there are those who believe perhaps the Welsh came here before. Were these mounds built by ancient Romans? And so, unfortunately, many of the farmers, some of the very first inhabitants here, the English farmers to inhabit Albemarle County, had no regard or respect for what they represented, and out of their own simple curiosity, they would dig into these mounds and pull out what they found errantly. They referred to them as curiosities, and yes, cabinets of curiosities had already become the custom of many when they would discover curious relics digging in the ground as they would plow and otherwise. Well, they would take these relics and place them in a cabinet. Oh, England was rife amongst the gentry and aristocracy of their great halls of curiosity. And so I believe that we ought to attend to a better understanding of what these mounds represented by following scientific and objective methods, a systematic methodology of understanding that. And by that I mean, and this was my first effort, survey one of these mounds. Then begin to provide a grid over the mound. So as you would begin to dig, then you could plot on graphed paper any discovery in the particular square in which it was discovered in that graft. And then furthermore, as I began to dig what you might refer to as test holes of my curiosity, I decided to dig one perpendicular sort of pathway from the side into the center of this mound. And that way, as you might be able to walk through, you could determine on the sides the layers of soil and relevant layers of relics that you would discover. Now, the mounds on the average were about, 12 feet high, or at least they had been, being plowed over by many a farmer. They have been brought down to about 7 feet high. They were, spheroidal, if you will, oblong, and the diameter was about 40 feet. So you can imagine that this was quite an effort to dig into the mounds in order to make a discovery and then to plot what you discovered. So that was my very first effort. Now, many say, well, Mr. Jefferson, did you do this at about the time you wrote of the experience in your notes on the state of Virginia? Well, of course, I brought those notes with me when I sailed to France in 1784. They were published then first in French in France. But long before the Marquis Barbet de Marbois had sent me his questionnaire, 23 questions about all of the curiosities, animal, vegetable, and mineral of Virginia. That was just as the war began. I had already been curious in these investigations. So what I explain and what I delineate in the notes, later printed in France, I had already pursued. I would say it was sometime about the early 1770s. It was certainly before the war began, because once the war began, I'm afraid that not only myself, but many of us were entirely preoccupied with pursuing our victory. And happily, that victory was realized. Your next question.
Do you have any archaeological objects on display here at Monticello?
Oh, I'm delighted to be able to show off, if you will, some of the relics that have been sent to me by many who have as innate a curiosity in antiquities as I do. I should point firstly, if you will, to this display cabinet here, because within this are curiosities from about the same area of our new nation. They have been found in the riverbanks, if you will, one in the Cumberland Riverbank through Kentucky and northern Tennessee, this known as the kneeling woman. This was sent to me by Harry Ennis in about 1790. A kneeling woman and very finely carved. Now, when we talk about curiosities, when we talk about discoveries from which we can establish facts, well, one of the curiosities has always been, and this raised by Dr. Franklin, did these natives, if they were indeed the Aborigines, the original people of North America, did they know the use of iron? Or were these objects that we discover cut with stone? Now, this is very valid. And there have been many theories about this because, as I mentioned, this kneeling woman is very finely carved. It is a representation, if you will, of a woman in the midst of labor, as I have referred to her. Was this cut by stone? Was it cut by iron? Well, we have not made any discoveries of iron objects that appear to be so very, very old. So you see, using the theory that, oh, those natives or whomever they were used iron, well, it's simply a theory until it becomes fact. And I have always been very, very decided in the pursuit of science not to rely too much on theory, because often imagination can take theory astray. And through mere theory or imagination, you will see what you want to see in anything you discover. But the continual effort to establish fact through objective and systematic methodology finally establishes a foundation that we can utilize as fact. And then we move on and we build on to that fact. So it appears that such a finely carved relic as this was cut by the natives using stone. The heads here are from much larger statuettes, if you will, that were discovered along the Tennessee River near Palmyra in Tennessee. Do you know that they were first sent down the Mississippi River to New Orleans? And then New Orleans, they were put on a packet ship to sail out the Delta and then around the Floridas, up, of course, the East Coast and up the Potomac, and then finally to be received by me in the President's house. And this was shortly after I had taken up my habitation in the President's house, after I had attended to my inauguration in March of 1801. They were overseen by the General of our armies, James Wilkinson. Suffice it to say that they did not arrive intact. Unfortunately, they were broken on the voyage, and I've always lamented that, and it was one of the reasons why I decided for safer keeping that I would have them sent right here to Monticello, and that is where they've been ever since. By the way, as I am pointing to this cabinet of curiosities, and let us hope the curiosities become less curious as we can study these the more so, as further facts in our discovery allow us a better understanding and enlightenment of who these people were and what these objects were created for. I have right here on display my particular design of the Indian peace medal. This is the design that I created to gift to the chieftains of the many native tribes that would be encountered by Captain Meriwether Lewis and Lieutenant William Clark on their Corps of Discovery, their expedition, which, mind you, lest we forget, was a scientific expedition. And in my instructions to Captain Lewis, I asked of him to provide any account that he might find of relics that were discovered of those that may have lived in the lands that they would venture through well before the natives that they had already encountered. So the piece metal was very different from the piece metals that had been designed of many a monarchical kingdom of Europe. There were piece metals from the very earliest European settlements here in North America in the former colonies of France and Spain, let alone England. Those piece metals were oblong, and they always had the likeness of the monarch on the obverse. On the reverse, they would have in the very top a crossed peace pipe and tomahawk, and then various vignettes of the European gifting to the native of the New World, something that would improve their livelihood, some modern creation of European kingdoms that it would make more beneficial for the natives considered the more primitive. Well, I decided, no. Now that we were looked upon as, if you will, a new nation here in North America, as the expedition was set out in order to make peace with the natives to be encountered out west, I designed something that would be immediately recognizable by those out west. A perfect sphere, 360 degrees, which even at a distance would represent to them the nature of all things. The sun during the day, the full moon once a month at night, and from the highest point in the terrain, the horizon all about. And rather than vignettes, if you will, of one people interacting with another, no, something that the native would well understand. Two hands clasped in friendship. And mind you, so that they would recognize this is intended for peace. There you have the crossed peace pipe and tomahawk, not diminutive, but much larger atop those crossed hands. So you see that the Corps of Discovery was indeed an effort not only of peace and friendship, but as well, if you will, of scientific investigation. The next question.
Bridget is curious if you have a favorite artifact.
My favorite artifact, Bridget? Well, I will tell you, I think these remain my favorite. They do, because having been born and grown up here in the vicinage of Charlottesville, and having known many of the native peoples from my youth, I still regard those early curiosities of my youth to remain just as valid, and they as well to remain just as good friends. You know, my father brought us up never to take from the native what we could otherwise peaceably purchase from them. And I have, despite lapses perhaps, made an effort to do so. So though you see many curiosities and relics brought back by Captain Lewis and Lieutenant Clark from their expedition, and I display them with pride here of those people with whom we must now continue to make peace, I still prize those arrowheads, those old tomahawk heads that I found along the banks of the Riviera when I was a young boy. Thank you, Bridget, for that question.
So today, scholars differentiate archaeology, which is the study of human artifacts, from paleontology, the study of plant and animal fossils. Is this the same in your opinion? Did you ever study plant or animal fossils?
That in the future, there will be a differentiation between archaeology and what you refer to as paleontology. Within the realm, as I had mentioned earlier, of antiquities. Antiquarian divisions into very specific studies. I welcome it. You are correct. Archaeology, more specifically, is the study of human civilization, the archetypes of past civilizations by which we can better understand the past and judge ourselves. And paleontology the recognition of past animal life in toto, such as Dr. Franklin has studied with regard to the bones that have been discovered at Big Lick down in Kentucky. Oh, I find that fascinating. Just a few miles to the west of Louisville, Kentucky, though I've never been there, they say along the Ohio River in the lowlands for many centuries already, there are discovered monstrous bones, extremely large bones of extinct animal life. Now, do you know originally there was a question on this, a supposition, a theory, that actually these large forms of animal life, and they were considered to be elephant bones, which is a testament to what they thought, meant that these large animals are still somewhere in North America. Well, there were others who contested. They said, oh, no, those have long been extinct here in North America. Well, the reason was why? Well, Dr. Franklin was one of the first to suggest, well, if indeed these are animals that may still be roaming the frontier somewhere, well, then what led to this extensive death? Could it have been that what we now know as the elephants of the Indias and Africas, once inhabiting North America, was at a time when the climate might have been warmer? Maybe the earth was turned a bit on its axis. Dr. Franklin, the great man of science and curiosity, was to hold that theory. Well, I will tell you that when Captain Meriwether Lewis set out on his expedition, we had already talked that he might visit Big Lick. And so he did as he was venturing down the Ohio to meet with Lieutenant Clark. And he sent me some of these monstrous bones, if you will, that were considered to belong to mammoths, great woolly mammoths. He sent me mammoth molars, if you will, that I continued to prize. And so it was that we began to discover from that a distinct science with regard to extinct animal forms here in North America. That is what fossils will provide us. And curiously enough, do you know why they refer to it as Big Lick? Because they are salt licks. They are places where not only do we observe now the animals, the bison, cows, whatever, I want to go and enjoy to lick, if you will, the salt from the rivulets of water that I want to then flow into the great rivers. But no, this is not just recent. This has occurred for millennia. Now, another form of animal life, more immediate here to all of us in Virginia, that is now distinct, may be discovered along the riverbanks more to the tidewater. I'm referring, of course, and I have one, here we go, right here, that I found along the banks of the James River. Now, I hesitate to say there are thousands of these. Well, I hesitate because there are perhaps millions to be discovered not only in the riverbanks, but perhaps in the tidewater 10, 15 feet below the surface of the ground at present. It is clear that though this was once a shell, a scallop shell that you might think, it is now stone. So this was not fossilized yesterday. Could it have been fossilized 4,000 years ago, as many believe? Well, I leave it up to you to judge, but I say, be cautious again of theory. Let us continue to pursue fact and build atop this. By the way, I've attended to Linnaean nomenclature to my discoveries, particularly this. And so since you find many of these in the tidewater of Virginia, and amongst the riverbanks of rivers that then flow into the Chesapeake Bay, I've referred to them as Chesapeactans. And there are smaller versions of this, a smaller species, if you will. These large ones have about 12 ridges. The smaller ones have about 5 to 7 ridges. So I have appropriately referred to the larger ones as Chesapeactan Jeffersonians, and the smaller ones as Chesapeactan Madisonians. So here, if you will, is a differentiation between archaeology, and here I have with me an implement that might have been used by the early natives of North America, and I mean not 100 years ago, but perhaps thousands of years ago, that has been discovered as an example of an archaeological relic, and here, an example of a relic of paleontology. I thank you for suggesting that differentiation. I will need to write that down. Your next question.
Renee is celebrating your love of science, and she wants to know what you might say to students to encourage them to study science.
I would say not only to students, I would say to young people, to adults, to those of us who grow the older with every day. Science, if you will, is mere and innate curiosity. We are a curious creature. We ask questions in order to understand. And a better understanding cannot help but be useful and helpful for all of us to have a better understanding of differences amongst us, let alone in nature. Science is fact. It is helped by theory, but it is the ultimate discovery of the fact itself. And even science is never precisely perfect. We will never find it that way. The reason is because it continues to improve. It evolves as we evolve, as the globe evolves, as we discover every day the universe continues to evolve. Do you know, to students everywhere, as you continue to read our Declaration of American Independence, ponder well. It does not hold anything new or original. That was not our business to come up with anything new or original, but simply to bring from the past what had been discovered as fact, and to disseminate that through the expression of the American mind in clear and simple terms. The revolution did not begin overnight. It had been working for many years. And what had been discovered for many years, we placed in our declaration as the body of that declaration. And we introduced it through this statement within the first paragraph. Let facts be submitted to a candid world. So in essence, science is also the science of the governing of mankind. Science is the study of human civilization. Science is the understanding of where we've been, to gain a better understanding of where we are. I will follow science wherever it should lead us, because I believe that man and science are on a continual advance. Your next question.
So one last question today. The history of the United States is still quite new when compared to ancient histories of other nations, kingdoms, and civilizations. Do you think future generations will be as interested or more interested in the archaeology of North America?
I believe that future generations will be as interested, if not more interested, in the archaeology and paleontology of the New World than perhaps we have had that opportunity in my time in the past. And the reason is because of education. I am hopeful that someday every child in our country may have the opportunity of an education, poor as well as wealthy, female as well as male, because that will instill in those fortunate to engage in an education, which I believe is a birthright of every individual. That will afford for them a greater excitement to study and to ask questions and to search for the facts of the matter, and never ever to discard their theory. It may be well valid, but to build upon it through observation, systematic and methodological discoveries will help them to better equip themselves to stand on behalf of the American debate, because we, the people, hold the reins of our government. So yes, science is important for us to help understand that validation as a citizen of our nation. So I am hopeful, very much hopeful, that this will continue through the future, become the more expansive unto every individual. And believe me, as I've said often, and particularly as we continue to meet here at our Monticello, I enjoy much more the dreams of our future than perhaps even the history of our past. Another question?
So, have you heard about other efforts around the world to study antiquities?
Oh my. And we can build upon other efforts and other ventures across the globe to discover past civilizations. Yes, I grew up with the opportunity of an education to learn about the digs, if you will, the antiquarian digs in ancient cities such as Pompeii and Herculaneum. That these had commenced, if you will, with a systematic effort of discovery in the early 18th century, that is, the early 1700s. They were engaged, if you will, by very wealthy gentlemen who had the means to employ scientific investigation, digging into these ancient cities. And mind you, before they did so systematically, there were many who just dug in to those ancient sites of Pompeii and Herculaneum and pulled out what they found without any regard for whom they may have belonged to at one time and those past lives. I referred earlier, if you will, to the Indian mounds as burrows. Well, yes, I have already read about many efforts throughout Great Britain to study burrows. Not so very different from the Indian mounds we have here. And that is why there was the conjecture, the theory, that maybe these mounds were built by Welshmen or other Europeans. But no, at present, there are many who are studying these barrows to come to a conclusion as to whether they were created by an ancient people many, many centuries, if not millennia ago. And did they use iron? So what is occurring now is the fact that universally, science is beginning to help us better understand that we are not the first people here. There were many people before us. And I cannot help but think that in this universal attention, that in the future we are going to discover more relationships inherent in the family of man that we have only been suggesting and talking about of late. More connections and more relations across this globe throughout mankind. Your next question?
Do you have any final thoughts or comments that you might say about archaeology to the group?
My final comment is to thank you for introducing me to the term archaeology. I am hopeful that I have provided some information novel to you that you may not have known before. I'm hopeful that I have provoked you to read and to study more, particularly those of you most fascinated with the subject of archaeology, let alone paleontology, if you will, altogether antiquities. But most happy to learn from you, archaeology. I shall use that. And I look forward to the next time we may meet here at our Monticello. And rest you assured, until then, I bid you a happy return, which I understand is going to commence this weekend, to make your way out west and to ascend nearly 900 feet above sea level and to enjoy the mantle of nature, the workhouse of nature, as I've referred to it. Rest you assured, until we meet again, I remain your humble and obedient servant, Thomas Jefferson. Godspeed.